And now we bring you Killer Wives, Episode 9, Paralysis. These are the case facts against Kimberly Hiriko, who paralyzed, killed, and cremated her own husband to avoid jail. Isn't trust a bitch? Talbot County, Maryland. Famous for the longest shoreline in the United States. The birthplace of former slave Frederick Douglass. And the murder of one Mr. Steve Hiriko.
What's your emergency? Give me the problem.
19 Sergeant Central. 19 Sergeant. You have a callback for 86 into Central? Negative K, nothing further. Just see the cabbie in the corner.
Kimberly Hiriko will recant to police how she was unable to reach her husband Steve through the flames of the fire. His charred remains would be discovered in that once shared romantic cottage. Ultimately, Mrs. Hiriko would have trouble explaining to investigators where she was over the last 2 hours of her husband being in that cabin.
This is Charles Rivers, and welcome to another edition of Killer Wives. It has been my experience dealing with relationships for over 3 decades that most people are attracted to the opposite in them when they look for love. Once they marry that person, they grow tired of that opposite difference, and it grates on them. Typically, if they have an affair with somebody else outside of the home, it will be with the someone that possesses the qualities that they hold closest to them. This case has all of these ingredients, and at its root, a motivator for murder. 9 years into their marriage, Kimberly Hiriko grew unhappy with each day of her marriage. But it was not always like this. And their closest friends, which was Mike and Maureen Miller, would testify to this fact in court. These two had grown close to Steve and Kimberly Hiriko from the time of their first meeting and earliest courtships. This is many years ago. All 4 close friends were either natives of State College in Pennsylvania, or students there while attending Penn State, or for 3 of the 4, both. So that's a tight-knit group. So if anything happens, they'll know about it. Now, Stephen Hiriko, the person who was murdered in this case, and Mike Miller became mutual best friends in the 7th grade in the town of State College and maintained that friendship through the day of Stephen's murder. Mike Miller had met his future wife, Maureen, who I named a few minutes ago, when she was an undergraduate at Penn State in the year of 1984. They both dated steadily after that. It was Maureen who first met Kimberly. This is the wife that murdered her husband in the story. She first met Kimberly as they worked together as a waitress at a steakhouse in State College. It was Mike and Maureen Miller who then introduced Kimberly to Steve Hiriko. They said, we introduced them and we went out on a double date. And from that point on, she says, they seemed to hit it off. Maureen testified, we went out on a double date, which a lot of couples do, but they don't set themselves up for murder. So out on a double date one evening, and Steve fell in love with Kimberly immediately, she said. When Stephen and Kimberly were married in March 1989, Mike Miller was Steve's best man, and Maureen Miller was Kimberly's maid of honor. That's how close the four people were. When Mike and Maureen in turn were married, a few months later, they flipped the script. Stephen Henrico was Mike's best man, and Kimberly Henrico was Maureen's maid of honor. Now, we go down the road about a year. So within a year of the marriage, Stephen and Kimberly gave birth to a daughter, and her name, Anna. Anna was 9 years old at the time that her mother brutally murdered her father. You may notice this in a lot of cases. There's always a child involved, so the father loses his life, the mother loses her life to prison, and the child loses out in both cases. Now, Stephen Henrico and Mike Miller took up the same occupation, the superintending and maintaining of golf courses. It was a very stable and lucrative business years ago. In the years after State College, Stephen Henrico was the superintendent of golf courses in Western Pennsylvania, in Dundalk, Maryland, and beginning in the early 1990s at the Patuxent Greens Golf Course near Laurel, Maryland. If you haven't been there, it's beautiful. I suggest you go there. Now, Mike Miller's career route took him first to New Jersey, and then in October of 1993 to the Harbortown Golf Course in St. Michael's. Now, the Harbortown Golf Course in St. Michael's is a beautiful place. Throughout the intervening years, and particularly after they were both settled in Maryland, the two couples maintained close contact with each other. They became very tight friends. Kimberly Henrico, his wife, was a certified surgical technologist. Now remember this. She was a certified surgical technologist. This job will come up again in his death. She was assigned to operating room, first at the hospital, which is the Holy Cross Hospital, from 1995 through to December of 1997. And after that, at Suburban Hospital, included in her responsibilities as a surgical technologist in the operating room was disposing of all unused medicines and drugs following an operation. Remember this. This is key. It's her job to dispose of these items effectively and not remove them from the hospital. Now, it was Mike Miller who was responsible for bringing the Henricos to Harbortown on the fateful St. Valentine's Day in which he was murdered. Stephen had telephoned his buddy sometime in January and indicated that he was looking for somewhere to go with Kim to spend a romantic evening. This came up because they were having a problem in their marriage, a big problem. Now, the agenda was to work on the marriage. Mike knew that Harbortown, where he worked, was having a Valentine's getaway weekend with a dinner theater. So you get both within that same romantic weekend. And he suggested it as a possibility. Stephen seized the idea, and Mike intervened to make certain that Henrico's would have one of the better cottages and one of the better times of their life. The cottage he gave them had a view of Miles River. Beautiful place. Mike and Maureen Miller even offered to babysit for the 9-year-old daughter Anna at the time. Remember? Now, although that offer was never taken up by the couple, their motivation was clear: to give Stephen and Kim this time away, because they know they needed it. They wanted these guys to remain close friends and to heal their marriage. Now, as Mike Miller testified, Maureen and I offered knowing that Kim and Steve were having some problems prior to that, and knowing that they both were going to come down here to work on their marriage or view it as a first date. You know, when you try to renew a relationship, we try to rekindle something you once had. That's what they were trying to provide that day of the murder. Now, at this point in the story, I want you to remember that the Henrico's closest friends lived with proximity of that golf course that they were going to go to that weekend, that romantic getaway. They lived within proximity. This will come up again in the case. Now, I also know that they had visited them there before many times because they're very, very close to the golf course. At this point in the story, Mike and Maureen suggested that they needed this time away. Kimberly's disenchantment with her marriage was in relatively low key until November of 1997. In addition to Mike and Maureen Miller's awareness that the Henricos were having some problems with their marriage, a number of Kimberly's close friends were also fully apprised of the growing discord in the marriage. So you gotta imagine that a wife, when she's in trouble in a marriage, she goes around telling everybody she's discontent with the guy except for the husband. So it seemed as if everyone Kimberly went or knew, she told everyone but her husband that she was having problems. A woman by the name of Mrs. Teresa Armstrong was a friend and former neighbor from Laurel, when she on one occasion asked Kimberly to explain her unhappiness with Stephen. Now, she received essentially the following reply. It was basically that there was a lot of verbal abuse. Now, he didn't do anything. She did everything. She was just completely unhappy with him anymore. She says, I'm done. I'm through. She didn't want to be married to him anymore. Now, another woman, Norma Waltz, was a former co-worker at Holy Cross Hospital. Kim described to her in detail the state of her marriage. She said that she had been feeling really bad about their marriage for a long time. Now, I ask you again, how come this woman is explaining everything to everybody except to the person she's having a problem with? And I used to counsel many years, couples, and they do this. Now, she said that her and Steve had been having problems and had been having problems for a very long time. She said, I told her that I had always suspected that something wasn't right, but she would never confide in me. And she agreed that she had been living a lie, she said, for a long time. She said that she had asked him to go to counseling sometime way back in late summer of 1997. Jennifer Gowan was also a co-worker of Kimberly's at Holy Cross Hospital, another person that she would confide in. This woman will confide in at least 13 people that her marriage sucks, but not the guy that she's has a problem with or the guy she's planning on killing. So remember, she confided in his girlfriend. When she got married in November 1997, Kimberly was her matron of honor. At the time of the final wedding preparations, the two discussed Kimberly's marriage. Kimberly said that she was not happy in her marriage, that she was considering possibly getting a divorce. Now, she says, after my marriage, after the honeymoon, when I got back 2 weeks later, we had more conversations. So the two women are talking after they got back from the honeymoon of the marriage. Separate couple. So Rachel McCoy had been a friend of Kimberly's since their days together in State College. Over the years, they talked at least once a week. Now, in September or October of 1997, Kimberly confided in Rachel. She told me that she had been looking into getting a divorce. So remember, from person after person, she's telling them she's thinking about getting a divorce. And that she wasn't happy in her marriage. That was really about it. At the trial, she was asked by the lawyer, did she express at all how she felt about him? Her answer at the time? Yes. She felt that he wasn't very helpful around the house, or he didn't like to go out and do stuff with her. Remember I told you in the beginning? Most people marry somebody opposite of their nature, and then they end up hating that opposite. So remember, he is opposite of her, but she married him for that. Now, she was much more outgoing than he was, and that really bothered her, and it started to bother her over the years. Thanksgiving and Christmas of 1997, however, Kimberly's smoldered discontent burst into a raging inferno. What was the spark? She said it was claustrophobia. And at that party, there was a man standing there, Brad Winkler. Another subject is going to come into the story. Mr. Winkler arrived on the last week of November. Jennifer Gowan was to be married on November 29th, and Kimberly was to be her matron of honor. Now, 1 week before the wedding, Kimberly hosted a bachelorette party for Jennifer in Easton. So this is at her friend's house. It began at the home of Maureen and Mike Miller, and later adjourned to a restaurant and bar, which the partygoers closed at 1:30 a.m. Now, after that, several days later, Kimberly threw a shower for the bride at Enrico's home in Laurel, Maryland. The very next day, the wedding party spent most of Thanksgiving Day at Enrico's home. So the party lasted all week. Now, at the very outset of that festive week, there appeared to be, at the edge of the crowd, an enigmatic new figure, Mr. Brad Winkler. Brad Winkler was a 23-year-old cousin of the bride and a sergeant in the United States Marine Corps, and he was stationed at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. These two are about to be in an affair with each other, the Marine and the murderer in the situation. She falls and is attracted to him immediately. Now, Though 10 years her junior, he immediately caught the eye of the discontented matron of honor. He reappeared at every event during the prenuptial week and increasingly was seen closeted in private conversations with Kimberly. So he is following a married man's wife who is complaining about her marriage. And the outcome would be an affair. Now, invariably, the two lingered after the rest of the guests had gone. Norma Walsh noticed that Brad was ever present. Initially, Kimberly was simply a good listener. Norma Walsh described a conversation she had with Kimberly in the car after we dropped Brad off. So after they dropped Brad off, the guy she's going to be into an affair with, she's starting to get really fond of him. So the two women are having a conversation about him after he steps out of the car. She says Brad has spoken of a bad marriage that he had and a pretty sad sob story. After he got out of the car, she made comments like, "Oh, he's such a nice guy. And the girl who'll catch him, is going to be a very lucky woman. And he's really sweet and he's really nice, and too bad what she did." But she's not thinking about what she's about to do to her own husband. When people hate their own spouse, they still fall smitten with somebody else. They can see what's nice in that person, but not nice in their own house. Okay, getting back to the story. As the only male other than the host at the wedding shower at the Henricos, Brad did not totally escape the notice of Steve Henrico. Again, Norma Walsh described the conversation with Kimberly. Kim had mentioned that Steve had gotten kind of ticked off and kind of wondering, who is this guy? Who's this guy following my wife? Who's this guy hanging around here? The party's over. It's a wedding shower anyway. And the next day, Kim told me, "Oh, Steve was just a little jealous because, Brad was hitting it off so well with Anna." Remember who Anna was? Anna is their daughter. So really, a strange man should not be hanging around a daughter of a married woman, let alone a married woman. Now, the smoldering tinder of late November burst into flame in early December. As a dutiful cousin, Brad volunteered to be both the house sitter for the honeymoon couple and the occasional babysitter for the honeymooners' year-old daughter. So he's right next door to the house of the woman he's going to cheat around with and a woman who's going to kill her own husband. Now, this will cause both houses to merge as one. During that period, Kimberly went over a daily basis to help Brad with his chores and to give him helpful pointers. Now, notice she is not giving helpful pointers to doing chores at her own house, but she's volunteering with a guy who's not her husband. Now, Brad himself pinpointed that moment when the companionship turned sexually active. He says, "I think it was that Friday night. I kissed her or she kissed me. They can't remember." He testified in court that weekend, I believe, is when it started. At the trial, he was asked, "And where would you have said your intimate interludes began?" His answer? First several times were at Sean's and Jennifer's townhouse. So he was asked another question. "And they were still on their honeymoon?" His answer? Yeah, they were still on their honeymoon. He was presented with another question later on in the case in the court. Question: "After that, where would you meet?" His answer: "At my aunt's house where I lived." As the affair reached a combustion point, the incendiary effect on Kimberly was such that she virtually lost all semblance of control. If you know anybody who's having an affair, they practically lose themselves. They forget they're married. They're actually servicing two people at one time. So compulsively, she telephoned Jennifer Gowan several times while Jennifer was still on her honeymoon and intimated that she was about to have an affair with Jennifer's cousin, Brad. So you're telling somebody, your best friend, you're about to have an affair with their cousin. Now, when Jennifer Gowan returned from her honeymoon in mid-December, Kimberly immediately informed her of developments in lurid detail. She told me that they were having sex and that she was becoming more and more dissatisfied with her own marriage. So once again, she tells everybody but her husband. She told me that she met while I was on my honeymoon at my house to have sex, and that she spent quite a lot of time with him, and that she enjoyed herself. We'll be back in just a moment. At about the same time she informed Jennifer Gowan of the extramarital relationship, she was also on long-distance phone to Norma Walsh in Port Orchard. Port Orchard is in Washington. Again, and cautiously, she could not contain the fact that she was having an affair with Brad, and that he was very affectionate and she really loved him. Notice how she talks about him as compared to her spouse. It was on New Year's Eve at the restaurant Laurel that she informed her former neighbor, Teresa Armstrong, that she was having an affair. She was having an affair with her friend Jenny's cousin. His name is Brad, she said. It was halfway through January when Kimberly met Rachel McCoy, a new person, her old friend from State College, and informed her that she was seeing somebody else. Notice, like I said before, she's telling everybody in the world that she's meeting this guy and having an affair with this guy and her plans to hurt her own husband. She didn't offer, however, the dubious reassurance, I'm not going to marry this guy. This is just about sex. Now, although Kimberly may not have wanted to get in a new marriage, she desperately wanted out of her old one. An ominous sign of that desperation was a bizarre conversation she had with a co-worker at Holy Cross Hospital. His name? Kenneth Burgess. Kenneth Burgess was a surgical technologist at Holy Cross Hospital who had came to work there at about the same time that Kimberly did in 1995. He had coincidentally been convicted of welfare fraud in Virginia about 12 years earlier and may have seemed to Kimberly a promising recruit to help in the murder of her husband. Somehow people believe that if somebody is willing to commit one crime that they'll graduate to murder. I have no idea. Now, at some time during the month of December 1997, he was standing, he said, with his back to the wall just outside the women's locker room. Now, as his back was turned to her, Kimberly said to Ken, I want to talk to you. Without warning, she blurted out that she wanted him to kill her husband. Just that, kill her husband. He said he spun around thinking that it had been some sort of a joke. Then when he saw her face and that she was deadly serious, he immediately said that he would not get involved in anything like that and tried to convince her that she was experiencing an overreaction to marital discord. If anybody came up to you with the same type of baloney story, what would you think? And if they came up to me, I would call the cops and tell them. Now, she nonetheless went on to ask if he knew somebody that would be willing to kill him. If not him, who would he know as a contract killer? She mentioned, moreover, that she'd be willing to pay $50,000 as a contract price. Now, after it became clear that Ken Burgess had no intention of getting involved, Kimberly urged him to forget about the whole thing. Don't tell anybody we talked about this, just forget about the whole conversation. Now, even as he declined the assassination role, Kenneth Burgess may nonetheless have pointed to a particular incident and planted a deadly seed in her mind. And apparently he was embarrassed by asking that, and his parting shot to her said, you work in the operating room, you could just put him to sleep. Now, whether planted by Kenneth Burgess or not, the seed grew. So did Kimberly's apparent compulsion to share her budding intentions of committing murder with anyone who would listen. So if you're going to go to court in the future for killing your husband, this is definitely not the way to do it. Now, in a New Year's Eve restaurant conversation with her friend and former neighbor, Teresa Armstrong, Kimberly first described how she was very angry and upset with their relationship. Now, remember she told everybody, so she said between her and her husband, then announced that she was asking him for a divorce, and in a very upset state concluded that she had even been thinking of different ways to kill him. Imagine, you tell somebody that you've been thinking of different ways to kill your husband. If you should do that, make sure you're unarrested and tried in court, because everybody knows about what you're going to do. So at one point during that conversation, Teresa Armstrong asked Kimberly, what would you get out of it? By doing this, what would you get out of it? Ms. Armstrong described Kimberly's response. She said, well, the insurance money. Remember, a lot of these cases that I bring to you guys, it's motivated by insurance money. She said she wanted insurance money so her and Anna, her daughter, can live the life they always wanted to, the way that she wanted to. Now, Ms. Armstrong stated that snippet of conversation came just after Kimberly had mentioned killing Steve. Other evidence showed that from two separate life insurance policies on Steve Henrico, Kimberly Henrico, his wife, stood to gain, as sole beneficiary, $450,000. Now, another confidant on almost a daily basis through January, early February was Jennifer Gowan. Remember this name, Jennifer Gowan. Jennifer Gowan was Kimberly's co-worker at both Holy Ghost, a suburban hospital, and Brad Winkler's cousin. Now, after sharing with Jennifer quite a lot of details about her intimate contact with Brad and about how very unhappy she was about what was going on with Brad, that she wanted to be with him. Kimberly further revealed that since November she had had sex with Steve once, her own husband, and that it made her want to throw up. Imagine this. She said sex with her husband just once that made her want to throw up. But sex with the other guy a lot of times was enjoyable. Now the marriage was obviously in trouble. In succeeding conversation with Jennifer, Kimberly's revelation escalated from her being interested in getting a divorce from Steve to revealing the fact that she would like to kill him in the first conversation. Now, Kimberly pointed out that one obvious disadvantage to traveling the divorce route would be that Steve might obtain custody of their daughter Anna. Now also I noticed in a lot of these cases, if the wife thinks she's going to lose custody of her child, that way propel her to murder. So she didn't want to lose custody of Anna, or that at best he would try to turn Anna against her. The conversation started with Kim saying that Steve would be better off dead. That we had talked about divorce, but she said that he would be nothing without her and Anna, and that they got a divorce, that he would try to turn Anna against her to keep her, and that he didn't really have very much of life outside of that marriage anyway, and that he would be better off dead. This is the fallacy of a lot of wives that believe their husband's world revolves around them. In subsequent conversations, Kimberly pointed out a second disadvantage to asking for a divorce from her husband. She acknowledged that it would be unwise for her to tell her husband about Brad. She said, now, this is funny, because maybe he would get depressed or angry enough to kill himself, and that if he did, that then they couldn't collect the insurance policy, because she says, I guess it would be suicide. And if a lot of you guys know about insurance, insurance does not pay out in case of suicide. Now, as discussions then became more detailed about a way in which she would kill Steve, Kimberly first mentioned of the drug that she would use. The drug she would use, sustainlacoline. We had a discussion about a case history where a woman had injected some children with this particular drug, and that it was a muscle relaxant anesthesia. This particular agent would be untraceable, she said, in an autopsy. So that was the conversation that they had that afternoon. Jennifer Gowan further testified that this drug was something regularly used by anesthesiologists in the operating room, and that both she and Kimberly had ready access to it. Now, at the trial that occurred after the murder, she was questioned as a surgical technician. If you wanted to have access to it, could you? Her answer? Oh yeah, yes, easily. Now, although her resolve was hardening and her plan of action crystallizing, Kimberly still desperately needed moral support. She constantly sought reassurance as to Jennifer being there for her. She insisted that if she did this, that she would be there for her. Kim wanted me to support her. She mentioned to me that her brother was someone who supported her, and that he would support her even if she killed someone, and she was asking me for support. And used those words many, many times. So in court, the attorneys asked her, question, did she ask you if you would support her under these circumstances? Answer, she did not ask me that directly. However, she did tell me that if I killed someone, she would support me. Jennifer Gowan also recalled that at some time in January or February, Kimberly told me that if I could kill Steve and get away with it, I would do it tomorrow. At about 7:30 that evening, she initially talked by telephone to her girlfriend from State College, Rachel McCoy, then living in Baltimore, Maryland. Rachel then went out to dinner with a friend. So she's called on the phone in Baltimore, Maryland, from where she lives at in the lower part of Maryland. When Rachel subsequently returned to her home at 9:30 that afternoon, there were 5 or 6 progressively more frantic messages coming from Kimberly on her answer machine. They were gradually sounding more and more panicky. And they just said, call me as soon as you can. Just call me when you get in. I really, really need to talk to you. Please, please call me. It kept going on. I just really need to talk to you. Call me as soon as you can get in. Now, Rachel immediately telephoned Kimberly back, who implored her to come down to Laurel as soon as she could to get there. She said, Rachel, you need me to come down here now? She said, I need you. Do you remember when I saved you in State College? I need you. You have to come here now. And I said, give me 15 minutes. She just wanted time to be able to walk her dog and that she would be on her way there. So she did. She took the dog for a walk. She got in her car and drove to her location. At that time, in that afternoon, Kimberly had been drinking and was very distraught. She said she was talking more about how it would be easier if Steve were dead. And she told me that she had a plan on how to do it. His plan to do it would be she wouldn't get caught. She was asked at trial, question, did she tell you the plan? Answer, yes. Question, tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury what the plan was. She told you. Answer, she told me that she would get a drug that would be used to paralyze Steve. This drug would stop his breathing, and then she would set the curtains on fire with a candle or a cigar, and that he would die of smoke inhalation in the fire, and nobody would know. Nobody. Now, take note. One of the items that would be recovered near her husband's body at the scene of the crime would be a cigar. This was especially odd because he never smoked. Rachel McCoy attempted to dissuade Kimberly from committing murder. She testified that she tried to poke holes in the story, but that Kimberly had answers for everything. Rachel urged her to consider the alternative of divorce, but to no avail. In the case, she was asked, question, did you try to tell her about the option of divorce? Answer, yep. I said to her many times, why don't you just get a divorce? And she seemed to think that this would be a much easier route. I don't know how. How can murder be an easier route over divorce? Rachel raised the question of effect of her father's death on Anna, again, to no avail. I also said, what about Anna? You know, she needs a father. And she told me that Anna will be better off without her father. Apparently, the only variation between Kimberly's plan of January 30th and its ultimate consummation on February 14th was the location of that planned murder and staged accidental fire. As of January 30th, that location was to be the Henrico home in Laurel, Maryland. Now, Rachel McCoy warned Kimberly about the risks once more to no avail. She says, I tried to say, what if your house burns to the ground? Your brand new house. Just listen to the sound. Your brand new house burning down. What if your neighbor's house catches on fire? She told me that the house wouldn't burn down. She assured her, if I set the house on fire, it will not burn down. Why? Because there's always neighbors up at any time of night in that neighborhood, and they would see the fire before the house burned down and call the fire department immediately. Wow, what a hollow story that you anticipate somebody else is going to catch your fall. Now, Rachel probed Kimberly about the accessibility of the lethal drug, about its traceability, and about the method of delivery. Once again, Kimberly had all the answers. She told me that she could get the drug at work very easily. There was only on every cart in every hallway of every OR. That they used it for trauma victims to stop their breathing so that they could put a tube down their throat or intubate them to give them oxygen. So it was there. In court, this was asked. Question. Did she, when she discussed with you the drug, did she talk about its ability to be traced? Answer. Yeah. She told me that it wasn't traceable in the blood. In court. Question. Did she mention at all how she would give it to him? Answer. She would inject him in a muscle. Rachel McCoy ultimately ensured that no crime would be committed on the night of January 30th to 31st at about 1:30 a.m. She stayed there to prevent him from being murdered. Kimberly went upstairs for a while to use the bathroom, but didn't come back right away. So Rachel went upstairs and found Kimberly standing over her husband on the opposite side of the bed, just staring at him, brooding with her hands to her side. She was contemplating killing him. She further described the scene. Steve was sleeping on the opposite side of the bed, and she was just standing there staring on the other side, staring at him with her arms down at her side, just standing there. And I just told her to come back downstairs. So she said she calmed her down from crying. She was in hysterics. And when she did calm her down, she told her that she needed to go upstairs and go to bed. Just go to sleep. She needs some sleep. And so she said she convinced her to do that. A few minutes later, Kimberly did go upstairs and go to sleep. Rachel, being cautious, waited for another 20 minutes to make certain that the immediate crisis had passed, and then she decided to go home to Baltimore, Maryland at approximately 2 a.m. that morning. Now, later on, she spoke by telephone to Kimberly early the next morning and received an ambiguous response to her inquiry in court. Question: did you ask her anything about the plan that she told you about? Her answer: yes. I asked her if she was really going to do this, and she said, I don't know what I'm going to do. I really don't know what I'm going to do. So, we'll be back in just a moment. Rachel waited for another 20 minutes to make certain that the immediate crisis had passed, and then left for Baltimore at approximately 2 a.m. She spoke by telephone with Kimberly early the next morning and received an ambiguous response to her inquiry. Question: did you ask her anything about the plan that she told you about? Answer: yes. I asked her if she wasn't really about to do this, and she said, I don't know what I'm going to do. That was her last communication with Kimberly before the fateful night of the events of St. Valentine's Day. Her testimony contained one other item of note. In the 9 years that she had known Steve Rico, she had never known him to smoke. 3 separate expert witnesses. 1, Dr. David Fowler, the Deputy Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland. 2, Mark LeBoux, a forensic chemist and toxicologist with the FBI laboratory in Washington, D.C. And 3, Dr. Timothy Wex, the anesthesiologist at the Holy Cross Hospital, testified as to the effects of the characteristics of the drug. In this drug, it is extremely dangerous, extremely fast-acting, and ultimately untraceable, they said. The FBI toxicologist testified that this particular drug is very dangerous, fast-acting, and a muscle relaxant, that it typically administered in a clinical setting in a hospital. He said it is very dangerous because you stop breathing. So in a situation like this, if you are to stop breathing, then you need to be in a hospital setting where they can intubate you and breathe for you, or somebody squeezes a bag and they breathe for you, but it's not something that you should ever consider doing outside of a hospital setting. So your body will still be able to breathe. You need somebody else. In such a setting, it is closely monitored. Mr. LeBoux also testified that this particular drug can take effect within 5 seconds of being administered intravenously, and within less than a minute after being administered intramuscularly. He pointed out that the body's natural defenses almost immediately break this particular drug down into 2 component parts that cannot be found naturally in the body, so that within a few minutes you may not be able to detect this particular drug in the blood specimen. And this is what she counted on. Now, it happens that quickly, he said. Dr. Fowler testified as to the potential lethal effect of this particular drug and to the speed with which it acts. The other substance which concerned me was this particular drug. It also found in operating rooms. It's a drug, he said, that causes very, very rapid paralysis of all skeletal muscles, which also involves the chest muscles. And he says also, it's been documented that this drug also stops the heart. So there's a short window of opportunity when you initiate the drug that it may stop the heart for a few seconds. So you must be in a clinical setting. He said it acts within seconds if it's given intravenously, and usually will actually begin to wear off within 2 to 4 minutes. Now, Dr. Vex, the anesthesiologist at Holy Cross Hospital, not only confirmed the characteristics of this particular drug, described by the other experts, but elaborated on its effects on breathing. In the court, he was asked, question: when a patient is placed on this particular drug, is it a patient? How does the patient breathe then? Answer: he said it depends on an anesthesiologist to breathe for you. A patient will not breathe themselves. And so when his wife had planned on giving her husband this drug, she knew he would not be able to breathe. She was under suspicion that he would have this drug, be incapacitated, breathe in the smoke, and die from the flames and the smoke of the fire. Now this is love, if I've ever seen it. So, he explained that you would need an artificial breather for you. He further pointed out that this particular drug is not inventoried as closely as narcotic drugs. is routinely kept, he said, in operating rooms or available in operating rooms for anesthesiologists, which she was. The last week of Enrico's marriage were filled with false hope, and the one and false witness in the other. The prospects of success for a romantic getaway weekend were dim. How dim was not yet apparent. Steve and Kimberly arrived at Harbor Town at about 3 p.m. on February 14th and were checked into the Cottage 506. On their arrival, they were presented with a bottle of champagne. At approximately 7 p.m., they went to the dining room and to the dinner theater production of The Bride Who Cried. Stephen and Kimberly left the dinner theater and returned to their cottage together between 10 and 10:30 p.m. Kimberly Henrico walked into the lobby of the resort alone at approximately 1:20 a.m. and reported that her room was on fire. The real-life drama in this case requires filling in the gap, that long 3 hours between the after supper in the dining room and the bedtime in the cottage. Kimberly Henrico is the only living witness to the interlude, and her account was suspiciously flawed. It was Elaine Phillips, the banquet manager, who also serving at the time as the night duty manager, who received the report from Kimberly that her room was on fire. Mrs. Elaine Phillips, cousin Philip Parker, along with other members of their family, was also standing in the lobby when Kimberly reported the room on fire. After Elaine Phillips checked the register to determine the room number, she and Philip Parker ran out to the front door, across the parking lot, and towards Cottage 506. 506 was registered to Henrico's. Cottage 506 is in a building 500, described as a villa consisting of 6 cottages, hotel rooms. The door to Cottage Suite 506, which was on a porch shared with Cottage 504, and 505 was locked. Philip Parker ran around to the back porch from which he would observe through a glass door smoke in room 506. He ultimately was able to open the sliding door through which he had observed human feet and legs. Crawling into the smoke-filled room, he found the body of Steve Henrico lying on his back between 2 twin beds. With help from Elaine Phillips, Philip Parker ultimately was able to drag the body onto the back porch. Steve Henrico was already dead. When dragged from the room, his body clad in a t-shirt and pajama pants was badly burned from the mid-chest area upward, including his upraised left arm. What was obviously called for was some explanation from Kimberly Henrico as to where she had been and what she had been doing between leaving the dining room at approximately 10:30 and reporting a room fire to Elaine Phillips at approximately 1:20 a.m. Kimberly's fullest accounts of the missing 3 hours were those given to Maryland State Police Trooper Clay Hartness in the company of Father Paul Jennings at approximately 2:30 a.m., and then a slightly more detailed version to Maryland State Trooper Keith Elsie at approximately 5 a.m. Now, she did not testify at her trial. She told the trooper that on leaving the dinner theater, she and Stephen had purchased 4 bottles of beer from the hotel bar and gone back to their room. Remember, 4 bottles of beer and gone back to the hotel room. She recalled seeing the end of a movie called Tommy Boy and then watching the late evening news come on. Despite a pre-Valentine's Day covenant with her husband that they would refrain from having sex during the weekend getaway, she said he began pressuring her for sexual intercourse, and an argument ensued between them that lasted for approximately 10 minutes. Because she did not wish to continue the argument, she said she grabbed her purse and her car keys and left the room. She describes how she then left the Harbor Town Resort and drove towards Easton to visit her friends Mike and Maureen Miller. She became lost, she said. However, and had to stop and ask several persons along the way for directions. Now, I might add at this point that she had driven to their house many times in the past. She stated that she was not familiar with the Easton community and could not find the Miller's home. She stated that she could not even find Route 50, and then, abandoning the intended visit, had to ask further directions even to get back to St. Michael's. Amazing. For a woman who had friends who lived in the area for years and knew exactly where they lived at. Now, she arrived back at Harbor Town shortly after 1 a.m. She said she discovered at that point that she had forgotten to take her plastic key card that the door of 506 needed, which was locked. She said she walked around the back to the deck area of the room, remembering that the sliding glass door at the rear of the unit had been opened early that evening. She says as she pushed it further open, she was met by a wall of thick smoke. She reached inside to feel for a light switch, but with no success. She then ran to the front of the unit and began knocking, she said, on a number of other doors and screamed for help, but received no response. At that point, she jumped into her car and drove to the main lobby, using her cell phone to call 911 while on the way. This is in her own words. In the lobby, she advised Elaine Phillips that her room was on fire. Now, did Kimberly attempted explanation become a part of proof of her guilt? It most assuredly did. It is a forensic fact of life that an exculpatory effort that is disbelieved thereby becomes highly inculpatory. In prosecutor jargon, it is called a false exculpatory. In algebra or production of burdens, it goes to prove consciousness of guilt. Kimberly's attempted explanation fell into that category in several regards. Indeed, it began to unravel even as it began. There was a first improbability getting lost, not just getting lost per se, but getting lost for 2 hours. Easton, the town, is no more than a 15-minute drive from St. Michael's. A 30-minute round trip. 2 hours could have been seen to the jury an inordinate long time to be lost in so relatively confined an area. Kimberly had herself driven to the Easton home of Mike and Maureen Miller just 10 weeks earlier. In terms of knowing the neighborhood, Kimberly's brother Michael Wolf also lived in Easton just 2 blocks away from the Millers. Kimberly was very close to her brother Michael, for it was Michael whom she asked to have called and who drove immediately to the Harbortown Resort in the pre-dawn hours of February 15th. It was of Michael that she spoke when she told Jennifer Gowan that her brother would support her if she killed someone. If lost, why not call the Millers for directions? As an alternative, why not call her brother Michael? Kimberly had and knew she had a cell phone with her in the car. It was operational, as she demonstrated at approximately 1:20 a.m. when she called 911. Kimberly, moreover, knew the Millers' number by heart. She recited it to Trooper Hartness, who she asked to call Mike Miller for her at a little before 2 a.m. As Bonnie Parker said, she rattled it off. She told Maureen Miller that Stephen had drank a lot and had gotten fairly drunk. Kimberly told Mike Miller that Stephen was sloppy drunk. She described to Trooper Elsie her noticing that Stephen, during dinner, was consuming a heavy amount of alcohol. Remember, a heavy amount of alcohol. A Talbot County Assistant State's Attorney who was seated at the same table with the Henricos throughout dinner, on the other hand, testified that Stephen had 1 beer. The bartender who served drinks at the table said the people at that table basically didn't drink. The bar bill for the Henricos collectively was $5.51, the price of 2 beers. The autopsy on Stephen Henrico's body showed a blood alcohol content of 0.00. At a follow-up interview on February 23rd, Trooper Elsie pressed Kimberly more closely with respect to Stephen's drinking. She said that Stephen drank a bottle of champagne on his arrival to the resort, and that at dinner table he was drinking heavily, both wine and beer. She stated that Stephen purchased more beer to take back to the room, and there was beer on the floor when they found his body. When confronted with the autopsy report and the blood alcohol content of 0.00, Kimberly had no explanation. A reasonable person returned to her hotel room with the ostensible purpose of going to bed and suddenly realizing that her husband was trapped in a burning room would not have displayed the remarkable composure exhibited by Kimberly. We'll be right back. The building block of which room 506 was a part contained 5 other units, of all which were occupied. Where one would have anticipated screams to pierce the fabric of the night, none of other occupants of building 500 was even awakened. Kimberly's arrival at the lobby at the resort was even more bizarre. As Elaine Phillips testified, there was neither excitement nor, for the longest time, even any indication that her husband was still inside of the burning room. Even for the most hardened professional, It is difficult following the commission of a crime not to exhibit anxiety about detection. Kimberly's behavior after Stephen's death betrayed a number of sometimes arguably but sometimes telling indications of consciousness of guilt. As she stood outside Cottage 506 with Bonnie Parker and later back in Bonnie Parker's room, her primary initial response was, "I want to see the body." That was, to be sure, an ambiguous response, but it could be interpreted as revealing a concern as to whether the charring of the victim's skin adequately obliterated as a puncture mark made by a needle. Such a reading takes on a greater plausibility in conjunction with Kimberly's later concern to learn the autopsy results and her strong desire that Stephen's body be cremated. In another telephone conversation between Kimberly and Teresa Armstrong, Miss Armstrong asked Kimberly how she felt about what happened in Harbortown the weekend of Valentine's Day. The answer was, she told me that she was feeling a lot of remorse. A conversation Kimberly had shortly after her arrest with Jennifer Gowan was even more revealing. Jennifer was visiting Kimberly in jail, and their conversation turned to the subject of the insurance money on Stephen's life. In court, it was asked, question, "Did you have any question to ask her about money?" Answer, in the jail. Question. Now, Kim said that "I don't care what anyone says. It wasn't for the money." That was obviously a revelation as to her motivation, and a rhetorical question that needed no answering was what for the money. In her second interview with Trooper Elsie on February 23rd, Kimberly teetered on the brink of a confession. Trooper Elsie confronted her with his knowledge about her affair with Brad Winkler. Although subsequently acknowledging it, Kimberly was initially stunned. At that time, she never said nothing. She just stared, he said. I advised her that we knew of her affair and that she was having with Brad Winkler. At that time, she still never said nothing. She just sat there and stared. And then she finally placed her face in her hands and looked up and said, she was then confronted with the autopsy report showing that Stephen had a blood alcohol content of 0.00. Her reaction was just to stare for a second and then protest that she did not understand how that could be. She was finally confronted with the fact that the autopsy report revealed that there was no carbon monoxide or soot found in her husband's body, not even from the cigar. At that point, she appeared ready to confess. And again, she stared and didn't say anything. And then she stared some more, and she said, "I don't understand why. I don't understand." At that time, she hesitated and never said nothing. And then she kind of bowed her face down towards her hand and started to cry. She continued to cry. I said to her, "Kimberly, please, tell me what happened that night." And she continued to cry. With respect to purely physical phenomenon of the fire in room 506, the key state's expert witness was Deputy Michael Mulligan of the Maryland State Fire Marshal's Office. Now, at the time, the first police officers and firefighters entered room 506. They confirmed that the prostrate body of Stephen Henrico had been lying on the floor parallel with two twin beds. So he lay in the middle of two twin beds. Now, on that same site where he was lying, two badly burned pillows had been beneath Stephen Henrico's head. Deputy Mulligan testified that the point of origin of the fire was those two pillows. He testified that intense heat from the flaming pillows caused the fire to spread to an adjoining bedspread, and that in turn caused a mattress on one of the beds to be burned completely. Now, there was also flames on the headboard of that bed and the wall adjacent to the burning bed. The carpet in various places around that bed also showed burning. The body of Stephen Henrico was badly charred from the chest area upward to the top of his head, including his upraised left arm. Deputy Mulligan was of the opinion that the fire had burned from between 5 and 15 minutes, but then burned itself out when the oxygen level in the room fell below the point where it could sustain the fire. So the door could not have been open. Now, a significant aspect of the fire scene investigators involved the process of elimination. Deputy Mulligan testified that 1. lighting could be ruled out as a cause of the fire. 2, spontaneous combustion could be ruled out as a cause of the fire. 3, the fire could not have an electrical origin. 2 possibilities remain. One was careless smoking, which we will discuss more fully in a moment. The other possibility was a fireplace in the room, which there was one. Deputy Mulligan eliminated that as a possible source of the fire. The only source of the fuel in there was a store-bought Easy Light log. He said when he got there, it was still warm, but it had been obviously for some time, and you had the crust of ash there with the paper match still evidently stuck into the ashes. He says, I don't believe it's possible for a spark to have generated from that log and come out of that doors and travel to that distance to those pillows and ignite those pillows. It's physically impossible. Now, as we shall discuss in a moment, he also eliminated careless smoking as a possible source of the fire. There is no dispute that the expert testimony of Deputy Mulligan was that all of these aforementioned possibilities could be eliminated as the cause of the fire. Those respective eliminators were all received in evidence. There was found in a room under a pillow on the masonry hearth near the fireplace an open 8-pack of backwoods cigars. A carelessly smoked backwoods cigar was immediately the prime suspect. Deputy Mulligan, over the course of a number of days, testing went on, heroic lengths in an effort to see if a backwoods cigar could indeed have ignited the room into fire. His conclusion was that it was simply not possible. The other possibility was that the biggest concern could be careless smoking because we located a pack of backwoods cigars. Of course, an 8-pack of backwoods. Now, they were under the pillows that was on the masonry hearth. To eliminate careless smoking as a possibility, he said, I went to Rite Aid in town here and bought a package of backwoods cigars. And Harbortown gave me a pillow and a pillowcase similar to the ones in the room that were that night. He says, I took it to Salisbury. In Salisbury, there was a burn towel for the fire department. Now, in Salisbury, they do drills, and for an hour and a half in the presence of George Kinhart, I lit these backwoods cigars. Originally, the first one I had, I laid it on top of the pillow, and the cigar would try to roll off the pillow. But we put it back on top of the pillow and made sure it stayed on there. The first time I did it, I left the cigar on there until it burned out. It didn't even make a mark on the pillow. But as the cigars would burn down and you got it down like a butt kind of thing, there would be more exposure from ash on the pillow from the cigar than anything else. So, he moved on. At that point, he says, I started putting a crease in the pillow, folding the pillow and over and lighting a cigar and putting it in the crease and waiting until the cigar completely burned out. And after I saw it not smoking from a while, I'd touch it with my fingers to make sure it was still completely out. Now, he would light the cigar again, put it back in there. I repeated this over and over. Never took more than 10 or 13 minutes for the cigar to go completely out. And in fact, it took the pillowcase off of the pillow and I exposed the pillow itself, the lining of the pillow without a pillowcase, directly to the ash. Again, propping the cigar ash to get a more direct contact to it. Now, he noticed it still kept going out. The last test I did, he said, quite frankly, I was getting nauseated from the cigars. He said, I took 3 of them and lit them and put them and propped them up where all the ash were down relatively close to each other, and it still wouldn't burn. On a separate occasion, he went to the testing facility and attempted to see if backward cigars applied to the bedspread could result in a fire. The result again was negative. He attempted to apply a burning backward cigar to the carpet and again not produce a fire. The result was the same with the bed itself and with Stephen's jacket. He concluded that backward cigars could not possibly have caused a fire in room 506. Not possible. It was a wash. To that point, as part of the physical examination done by Deputy Mulligan, the backward cigars were merely negative evidence, something eliminated as possible source of the fire. The backward cigars, however, were to take on a far greater significance as aforementioned proof of both arson and murder. It would ultimately be shown that the cigars were the centerpiece of an elaborate ruse carefully staged by Kimberly to make it appear that Stephen had died in an accidental fire caused by careless smoking. The setting of a false trail is strong aforementioned evidence of guilt. Kimberly had told Trooper Elsie that Stephen smoked when he drank. Mike Miller, on the other hand, who had known Stephen all of his life, testified unequivocally that Stephen did not smoke. Never seen it happen. If Stephen Henrico did not smoke cigars or anything else, how then does one account for presence of a package of backward cigars in the room where he was murdered? Because this was not an accidental burning, not a drunken state. Now, within several weeks of his death, those cigars would be accounted by a painstakingly thorough investigation by the Special Investigation Unit of Maryland State Police. After investigators approximately 25 stores in the Laurel area to see if they carried backward cigars, the state police ascertained that the cigars in question had come from Astor Liquor Store in the Laurel Shopping Center, within several miles of Hicker's residence. Now, Kimberly Henrico had been a customer there on more than one occasion, and a clerk identifying her photograph, he was able to remember that one afternoon in January or early February. It was Kimberly Henrico herself who purchased a package of backward cigars. A document examiner with the Maryland State Police was further able to ascertain that $2.49 marking labeled on the package of backward cigars found in the room of 506 had been made by the Monarch marking gun used by Astor Liquor Store in Laurel. Busted. It was Kimberly who brought the cigars found at the murder scene. There was evidence to show that in staging that was designed to look like an accidental fire resulting from careless cigar smoking, Kimberly had 1. Lied to the police about her husband's drinking. 2. Lied to the police about her husband's smoking. 3. Planted the cigars that were supposed to look like the instrument of the accidental fire. The ruse of an accidental fire had a due purpose. Primarily, it was to serve as a apparent cause of Stephen's death, or it all went well. It was to be the actual cause of Stephen's death. Secondly, it was to obliterate the charring of the skin, any puncture mark left by the needle through which poison was injected into his body. With respect to its primary purpose, the ruse failed utterly. The medical examiner report on Stephen's body revealed that there was no carbon monoxide and no soot in his lungs or in any other part of his body. It was conclusively established that he was already dead before the fire could have any effect upon him. The expert opinion of the medical examiner was that the manner of Stephen Henrico's death was homicide, and that the cause of death was probable poisoning. Without rehashing all of the evidence we have recounted at length throughout this opinion, the evidence was overwhelming that Kimberly Henrico was a homicidal agent. In terms of linkage between the poisoning and the fire, Kimberly had laid out her plan of action with precision to her friend Rachel McCoy just 2 weeks before she put that plan into operation. Now, Rachel McCoy recounted Kimberly's intended course of action. She told me that she could get a drug that would paralyze Steve, that would stop his breathing, and then she would set the curtains on fire with a candle or a cigar, and that he would die of smoke inhalation in a fire, and nobody would know. She said nobody would be the wiser. The only thing that went awry was that the plans was that instead of paralyzing Stephen so that he would die of smoke inhalation, Kimberly gave him too much of the drug and he died immediately before having the opportunity to inhale any smoke into his lungs. On March 19, 1999, in Eastern Maryland, the judge sentenced Miss Henrico to life in prison for killing her husband after the couple watched a murder mystery play on Valentine's Day. Judge William Horn also sentenced Kimberly Henrico to 30 years on a related arson conviction for setting fire to the room where her husband's body lay. The 2 sentences are to be served concurrently. We'd like to thank you for watching this episode of Killer Wise. Join us next week when we bring you another story of a wife who promised to love, honor, and cherish, and then did none of that. For Killer Wise, this is Charles Rivers. Thank you for watching.